hydrofracking, I introduced the legislation to ban hydrofracking in New York State. I personally do not think that there are any strong regulations that we could possibly implement to protect the water supply and the environment. This hearing, this forum today, is to elicit testimony from everybody because of the fact we seem to have some indication that the governor and the Department of Environmental Conservation are moving ahead all of a sudden rather quickly, and the possibility of permits being issued could come rather quickly. The governor said early on that he would make his decision on whether or not to do hydrofracking based upon the science. And we have a number of people here that will testify to the fact that we haven't heard from the science. And if anything, the scientific expertise and testimony that has been out in the public forum indicates that hydrofracking is not a safe practice to allow in New York State. So I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you. There are obviously other aspects to the testimony today, including the fact that apparently State DEC released some of the proposed regulations to the oil and natural gas industry prior to releasing to the public, which a number of us feel is highly unethical. We also found out last week that Nationwide Insurance Company considers hydrofracking too much of a risk to underwrite. So there are a lot of things that are now coming together that we need to talk about here today, and hopefully convince the governor and the Republican-controlled state Senate that hydrofracking is not a good thing for New York State, that we must protect New Yorkers from this very dangerous environmental issue. I've said publicly, and I'll end with this comment, that hydrofracking is the most serious environmental issue that this state has faced in 100 years, and the ramifications, if we allow it, could be with us for 1,000 years. Why don't I start on my left? Senator Dabba, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Senator Ravella, and I want to thank you and your staff for doing this forum, and I want to thank all those who are here with us today. Thank you for your time and for your input on what is, in my belief, the single most current environmental issue this state is facing, and possibly, and most likely, in its future history for this state as the most important environmental issue that we will be dealing with. The negative aspects of fracking are irreversible. And so for our people, for our businesses throughout this state, these ramifications, they will live with forever. So it's important that we deal with these issues as we go forward in a very cautious manner. As our Senator Vella has mentioned, the governor looking forward to possibly issue permits. We need to be very careful as we go forward, and certainly it cannot be done without input from our people. So again, I appreciate your time and your input and your testimony today. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Perkins.
Thank you very much. I want to first thank you very much for convening this forum, this opportunity for us to share with the public our concerns, and to also let it be clear to Governor Cuomo to stop fracking around with our help. I'm New York State Senator Bill Perkins, and I'm opposed to hydrofracking because it puts our children's future at risk. New York City residents have a tremendous stake in whether Governor Cuomo allows hydrofracking in New York. This dangerous method of natural gas drilling threatens our water, air, food, and health. Along with a growing number of elected officials, local leaders, and community organizations have come to the conclusion that fracking is not safe and should be banned statewide. Fracking involves injecting millions of gallons of water mixed with toxic chemicals and sand underground to release gas that is trapped inside shale rock. While this drilling would occur many miles from the 5 boroughs, the health of our city's 8 million residents would be threatened by the pollution, toxins, and dangerous waste produced by fracking. In New York City, we enjoy some of the greatest tap water in the world, and it's something that we are proud of as New Yorkers. Our water comes from watersheds upstate that are so pure and well protected that it does not have to be filtered. In addition to jeopardizing the health of New York City residents, contamination of these watersheds from fracking could require the construction of an estimated $10 billion filtration plant. The fluid used in the fracking process contains around 600 chemicals, many linked to cancer and other health problems. Up to 80% of this toxic fluid stays underground, where it could eventually flow into our sources of water. Moreover, there is no safe way to treat the toxic wastewater that is brought back to the surface. The bottom line is this: the Cuomo administration's proposal to protect New York City's watersheds is inadequate to ensure the safety of our water. And from an environmental justice point of view, fracking also threatens New York City's air quality. In the 30th Senatorial District, which I represent, we have some of the highest incidences of respiratory disease and asthma rates that are already tragically high. Fracking requires thousands of heavy-duty truck trips to bring water, equipment, and chemicals to drilling sites. And the fracking process itself can release particulates and other pollution that form smog, which has been linked to asthma, heart disease, and other health problems. A largely populated county in Wyoming, overrun by fracking, now has the worst air quality than even in Los Angeles. Another way New Yorkers' health is threatened by fracking is by radon, an odorless and invisible killer. The shale formations in New York contain high levels of radioactive gas. The DEC tests have found thousands of times the maximum level of radiation in wastewater produced from shale wells in New York. The high levels of radon present in New York shale gas deposits which travel with the extracted natural gas and pipelines to our homes in New York City. If you use a gas stove or heat with natural gas, terrifying amounts of radon could silently and invisibly spew out of your burners and end up in your lungs. If all this isn't enough, fracking also endangers the safety of our food. Upstate New York, where the fracking would occur, is a major source of apples, dairy, vegetables, and a vast range of other agricultural products that we eat. The water and air pollution from fracking threatens the health of our land and food, a reason why a growing number of chefs, farmers, and other food producers have joined the fight against this dangerous practice. Furthermore, in the states of Ohio and Pennsylvania, where hydrofracking has been permitted, a rising incidences of earthquakes and other unusual seismic activity points to yet another potential danger of this controversial mining process. There is evidence linking fracking to earthquakes, and the methane leaked by fracking is a major contributor to climate change. On top of that, the industry's job creation claims are wildly overblown. Any jobs created by hydrofracking would only be temporary and not worth the long-term implications of contaminating our air, water, and food. The evidence is in, and the science is clear. Fracking is inherently dangerous, cannot be done safely, and is beyond our ability to regulate. I am proud to stand with my Senate colleagues and a growing movement of New Yorkers who are calling for a ban on fracking in New York. We urge Governor Cuomo to join us in standing up to oil and gas industry and ban fracking in New York. Stop fracking around without help.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
I stole it from you.
Senator Kruger.
Thank you, everyone. Well, I'm very proud to be here with my colleagues, and particularly Tony Avella, who's been an incredible leader in the fight to educate the legislature and the public to the dangers of fracking. And I think my colleague Bill Perkins pretty much just went down the laundry list of why it is clear to me, and has been, that the science and the evidence are quite clear that this cannot be done safely anywhere in the state of New York. Perhaps someday the industries will figure out a way to remove gas from below the Marcellus Shale without putting our environment at risk, but clearly that is not the reality today. Now, the good news is we don't actually need that gas today, and it will stay there underground. And when someday somebody comes up with a mechanism by which to withdraw natural gas, and if we need it, can be done safely, then it will be still there waiting for us. But at this point in time, there is no justification to put our environment and our people at risk from signing off on permits in any of the counties of New York State to drill. And And I actually think this is a great example of doesn't matter who runs your government. I'm very confident that if my Democratic colleagues were the majority in the Senate and Tony Avella was the chair of the Environmental Committee, both houses would have passed legislation in the last section that made sure that none of us had to be worried about permitting going forward. Unfortunately, we don't yet have that reality, and so we continue to have public hearings so that you, the public, the experts, the scientists can tell us why we must not allow hydrofracturing in New York State. Thank you, Tony.
Senator Squadron.
You know, it's a funny thing the way that this issue has developed over the last few years. I remember maybe 4 or 5 years ago, it was an inevitability that, of course, we wanted to have fracking and as quickly as possible until just a few people, probably even a fraction of those in this room, started to raise some alarms and concerns. And in that time, the evidence has rolled in. And those few people, those canaries in the coal mines, or whatever sort of animal you have at the bottom of a fracking well, were proven to be correct and really prophetic in their understanding of some of the side effects. And today we're in a situation where there's some good news. There is a growing consensus that there is no way that fracking should be done in the New York City watershed, that it's just too important. That's great news, but the other side of that coin is a little bit strange. If it's not safe enough for the New York City watershed, why is it safe enough to do anywhere? Why is it safe enough for the Delaware watershed? Why is it safe enough for areas along the southern tier or in any county in New York State where you happen to have humans and communities and an ecology? So look, if we have locations that don't have humans, don't have an ecology, don't have communities, there might be a reason to do it there. But until we find those, I think it's clear there is no reason to rush into fracking. It doesn't make any sense. And thank goodness 4 or 5 years ago, before the cry and the science had gotten to the level it is today, we didn't rush in. I just shudder to think what information, what science we'll have 5 years from now. Let's just hope it won't be too late. I really thank especially Senator Avella and all my colleagues, but Senator Avella in 2 offices now has been one of those creatures down at the bottom of the fracking well crying the alarm, and your leadership and as a colleague is really deeply appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. We've also been joined by Senator Montgomery. Senator.
Thank you. I also join my colleagues in thanking Senator Avella for leading our conference on this issue. It is one that is extremely important to constituents that I represent, even though I'm from Brooklyn. And I think that we have been joined by people from around the state in expressing concern. I have certainly testified before the DEC and made my positions known. I am absolutely against this hydrofracking. And I want to also thank the people in this room and those from across the state who have been in Albany every week to remind the governor and to remind the legislature that this is the #1 environmental issue in our state, across political divide and across the regions in our state. So thank you, Senator Avella, and I look forward to hearing more from people who understand this issue and who are willing to put their lives on the line to make sure that we do the right thing in the state of New York. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Montgomery. Some of my colleagues have touched upon this, and I wanted to reemphasize. I believe this is the single biggest grassroots effort on one single issue that I have ever seen in New York State politics and government. And it's the fact that hydrofracking hasn't occurred yet is due to everybody in this room and those well beyond that. I mean, people all over this state are rising up. I happened to do a farm tour the past 2 days in Shenango County, and it was interesting to see the no fracking signs in front of people's homes all over Shenango County. We're going to win this battle at the end of the day, and it's going to be because of you, all of you. So with that, the first speaker is Thomas Cluteret from the Environmental Working Group.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here to speak about New York's decision on whether to allow high-volume hydraulic fracturing, a decision that will certainly have a profound impact on the Empire State for decades to come. My name is Thomas Cluteret, and I'm Assistant General Counsel for the Environmental Working Group, or EWG. For years, EWG has worked closely with citizens, public interest groups, and lawmakers at all levels of government to champion policies that protect public health and the environment. As I mentioned on the steps of City Hall last week, EWG has closely followed New York's fracking debate since 2008, when we were invited to testify before the New York City Council, raising concerns about the inherent risks of shale gas drilling. Like many others, we also submitted public comments to the DEC on its draft drilling plan, highlighting the plan's many critical flaws and scientific gaps. Taken together, the draft plan, its shortcomings, make clear that New York is simply unprepared to make a decision on hydraulic fracturing at this time, or at least one that is informed by best science. Further, records EWG obtained from the DEC show that this lengthy review process may have already been compromised when the DEC gave gas drilling companies exclusive access to detailed rule proposals and draft permit language. That access gave drillers an opportunity to influence this rulemaking process weeks before the public even saw the draft rules, despite pledges from the governor that this process would be fair and transparent. In one blatant example, a drilling industry attorney who represents Chesapeake Energy Corporation, among other oil and gas companies, used this opportunity to try to weaken testing requirements for radioactive pollution that might run off of drilling sites during heavy rains. As you would expect, the DEC has criticized EWG's Inside Track report, which brought this preferential treatment to light. The regulators say they've done nothing wrong by sharing these documents with oil and gas companies. According to them, it was not only justified but necessary to meet their obligations under New York state law. Let me be clear. EWG has never suggested that the DEC engage in unlawful activity in this rulemaking process, and yes, we recognize that regulators have to develop cost estimates for their regulations and analyze how they will impact the subject industry. But nowhere in the law does it say regulators must share detailed rule proposals or specific permit language with the drilling industry outside of the public's eye behind closed doors. Nowhere in the law does it say regulators can cover themselves by citing vague language on the DEC's website, which simply says regulators have communicated with all sorts of stakeholders. Hardly a public acknowledgement that they have shared key documents with the drilling industry, and only the drilling industry weeks in advance. And nowhere in the law does it say regulators must engage in preferential treatment and leave it up to public interest groups to file records requests to reveal how the draft plan could be so tilted toward the drilling industry. We challenged the DEC to explain in detail how this behind-the-scenes dealing with the drilling industry is in fact necessary under New York state law. We also challenged the DEC, and the governor's office for that matter, to fill in glaring gaps in the records we obtained in response to our initial records requests. For example, we received emails in which regulators said they were going to send key documents to the drilling industry, but we never received copies of those transmissions themselves. We received documents mentioning meetings and phone calls with drilling representatives, but no records of what was said and what was done during those meetings and phone calls. I should add that we did not receive a single phone record generated in 2011 between 7 members of the Cuomo administration and some nearly 24 drilling companies and their representatives. I find it hard to believe that there were no such calls. As the New York Daily News reported on Sunday, the governor and his inner circle prefer to communicate using BlackBerry pen-to-pen messaging if they cannot talk by phone. Unlike regular email, this leaves no real paper trail. Perhaps that explains the gaps in the records we received. If others in state government and the drilling industry are following the governor's example of conducting business in ways that creates no permanent record. We may never know what has happened behind the scenes as the state's draft drilling plan makes its way to the governor's desk. As the governor said, however, this rulemaking process must be fair, transparent, and science-based. So far, it has not lived up to that standard, not in the backroom dealing between the drilling industry and regulators, not in the state's badly flawed and unscientific draft plan, and not in the modified proposal the Cuomo administration floated last month in the New York Times. As you know, that plan would limit drilling to several counties along the Pennsylvania border or to areas where the Marcellus Shale is 2,000 feet below the surface and the shale is at least 1,000 feet from any water supplies. Well, EWG has carefully reviewed thousands of pages in the draft plan, industry studies, and government reports. And we can find no scientific basis for the idea that these limitations would be sufficient to protect New York State's precious water supplies, as the Cuomo administration maintains. In fact, a variety of evidence suggests otherwise. A 1987 EPA report to Congress found that a shale gas well hydraulically fractured at a depth of more than 4,200 feet below the contaminated water supply just 400 feet from the surface. Industry studies have found that oil and gas wells routinely develop leaks that allow gas and potentially associated contaminants to migrate from the deep underground to the surface. The U.S. Geological Survey has found that rock layers above the Marcellus Shale are already highly fractured by natural processes, providing pathways for contaminants to migrate upward into New York's water supplies. The Geological Survey has also found that New York officials don't even know where the locations of many of these underground water supplies are. Given the survey's concerns and its status as one of our leading scientific agencies, EWG would like to see the survey analyze Governor Cuomo's modified drilling proposal before any decision is made. As we've said before, New York cannot afford to be drilling first and asking these important questions later. New Yorkers deserve a plan that is backed by best science and a review process that is truly fair and transparent. Only then can Governor Cuomo know how and whether shale gas drilling can be conducted safely. So with that, I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I'm sure my colleagues are going to have some questions. My first one is with respect to the fact that the proposed regulations were given to the oil and natural gas companies. Now, the state D.C. is apparently saying that they are mandated to do it. You mentioned that in your testimony. Have they said to you what section of the law required them to do that? Have they actually given you a section of the law?
They responded to the Albany Times-Union, which initially ran with our report, with a general sweeping statement about basically that they have to take this information to develop cost estimates, but they didn't cite specific provisions of the law, the State Administrative Procedure Act. And certainly, I'm not a New York attorney, but looking at that law, just because they have to develop cost estimates doesn't mean they have to proceed with this kind of discretion to allow this kind of backroom dealing as far as we are concerned.
Agree with me, but wouldn't you say this is a huge conflict of interest for the state to give proposed regulations to an industry that they're going to later regulate?
Absolutely. The very idea that for months we were under the impression that everybody got to see these draft rules at the same time and to submit comments through this process. And then we find out the report we had and we were finally able to pull everything together came out in June. That's months later to realize that not only were the drilling industry representatives seeing these documents before the rest of us got a bite at the apple, they were having an opportunity to try to weaken the standards or the permit, for example, to remove testing requirements for radioactive pollution, which we've seen it can be highly carcinogenic.
Questions from my colleagues? Who wants to go first? Senator Kruger?
Just for the record, when we learned about this through your FOIL, which I appreciate very much, we also, a number of us wrote to DEC asking for an explanation, a justification, and an understanding of what might have changed between their initial draft that went to the industry and the actual draft that the rest of us got to see. For the record, we haven't gotten a response yet.
Sure, and I'll say, although the testing requirements for radioactive pollution are still there in the draft permit, given these gaps in the documents we did receive, and the fact that this plan is so tilted toward the drilling industry, we have many lingering questions about what else may have been happening there, and we'll continue to ask those questions and hope that the department will provide those answers.
Perkins.
So have you had an opportunity to share your concerns with the governor?
We have not reached out directly to the governor. and we've not received a response to him so far. We did follow up with additional Freedom of Information Law requests to address those apparent gaps. I think we sent an additional 10 to the department and the governor's office to try to close in some of those gaps.
So this, I just want to be clear. So in your efforts to kind of get a sense of where the governor was coming from, you contacted his staff or the agency, or how did you go about doing that?
The way we've done this is through our Freedom of Information Law request.
Okay. And so I noticed, since you haven't had a chance to engage him, I'm just wondering, why would the governor put himself in such a contradiction in terms of allowing the industry to have access to certain information that normally wouldn't be allowed, the lack of transparency and accountability? What do you think is that? What do you think is his motivation here?
I think at the very least, the governor should have questions for the very experts he's going to be relying on to inform this decision. And I'll leave it to the governor to do that outreach, and hopefully the people of New York and lawmakers will ask those questions of the governor and his experts.
Thank you.
We've also been joined by Senator Stuart Cousins. I also, in addition to Senator Krueger, sent a letter to the governor after this and DEC commissioner about this issue, asking for what section of the law requires the agency to do this, and similarly, as you did, ask for copies of everything that was sent to the oil and natural gas companies. I haven't received a response either. It's very disconcerting that the agency that is supposedly supposed to protect the environment is in fact cooperating with the industry that we're very concerned about. It leads one to believe, what is moving the system? Is it the science, or is it the money that the oil and natural gas companies are distributing throughout the system? Very disconcerting. Any final comments?
I think, as you pointed out a few moments ago, at the very least, the fact that we have an apparent conflict of interest demands more answers before New York can proceed with this decision.
Good. Thank you. And thanks for the good work that you're doing on this issue.
Thank you.
The next panel is Chip Northrup and Ronald Bishop.
Chip. Must be the tall one.
I'm Chip Northrup. This must be Ron Bishop. Dr. Ron Bishop. I was an oil and gas investor mainly in the offshore. Do you mind if I go first? In the oil and gas business for about 30 years, mainly owning offshore and onshore oil rigs. We, my lovely wife Nancy and I, summer up in Cooperstown, and I became involved in these issues when we moved up here. Let me answer the question that you posed. And there's actually a pretty simple answer. The reason why the DEC is so conflicted, and by the way, I submitted a paper on this. In most states, in most oil and gas producing states, the environmental regulatory task is separate from the minerals management task. Out of the shale states, quote unquote, there's only 4 states that combine that function into one agency. Most states obviously do not. And so what that does is that gives the environmental task, or the environmental regulatory task, a fair shot at being independent and autonomous to the minerals management function. It doesn't always play out that way, but it gives them an opportunity. So the problem that you're faced with here, and these FOIL documents indicate it, is that basically you are functionally you're dealing with a minerals management agency. I mean, it's called the DEC. It has nominally an environmentalist as its titular head, but you really in this regard, at least for this activity, shale gas development, you're dealing with a minerals management group. When we go as environmentalists to see the DEC, we're ushered in to see Jack Dahl, who's in charge of well permitting. And he just gives us a blank look, because water, that's not his bailiwick. Same thing with Allison Crocker, the attorney that was in the colloquies with Tom West. They're basically in the well permitting business. God bless them. There's agencies to do that in other states, but they're not. That activity or the environmental activity is not co-opted, coerced, subordinated to the minerals management function because it's a separate agency. So, that's the problem, if you will. It's a structural problem. I'm not sure how it came about, but it would have to be fixed because the problem is you would never be able to disassociate the influence of the well permitting function, Jack Dahl, Allison Crocker, that gang, from the environmental regulatory, as long as they're under the same head. One of them is going to predominate, and guess which one it's going to be. Just to go over a couple of things. To back that up, as a for instance, and this goes back based on these foiled emails. This goes back at least to 2005. Well, let's take 2008. West had a meeting with Jack Dahl. He had 7 people from Chesapeake with him. March 26, 2008. He goes in there, and they were going to do the spacing unit size, the size of the gas well spacing unit, as a draft. And they're also going to address the setback of a gas well from the property boundary. Well, so Chesapeake marches in there with 7 attorneys, to see Jack and to Allison, and they put down this 640 acres, a square mile, one section, as a spacing unit size, and they say, well, the setback of the gas well from the property line would be 330 feet. Well, guess what? Existing New York regs that might have had an environmentalist involved with it, or a hydrologist, or a geologist, scientist, there was up to 1,500 feet was a setback at the time. And of course, when West and his compadres marched out of there, the DEC changed that, and now they proposed that in the S guys, magically, 1,500 feet went to 330 feet. There was no environmental review. And mind you, I'm not being cynical. I'm just telling you that there was no environmentalist there. There was no hydrologist, nobody to review it, to even say no. It was okay with Dahl. He issues well permits. God bless him. That's just one instance. This obviously the compulsory integration law was written by West, who then teed up people to force them into wells. That was in 2005. Probably one of the worst laws, compulsory integration laws, in the United States. But more importantly, the way it's applied in New York is just flat wrong. They will force a guy, a man and his wife, into a well in their household on a 40-acre spacing. There's compulsory integration laws in other states, Texas. In Texas, maybe twice in the last 60 years is it applied. Only under exceptional circumstances is a compulsory integration law applied, even in other states that have a higher supermajority than New York. New York's got 60, most states have 70. Not so. The DEC has got a whole queue of compulsory integration cases lined up, and the applicant is represented by the same guy that wrote the law, Tom West. I thought I'd seen it all in Louisiana, but this place tops the cake. I'm sorry, fella. Ladies and gentlemen, but that's the way it is. Now, the question is what they run for cover over is this Article 23 of the New York State Environmental Conservation Law. That's where it mandates mandates to maximize the efficiency of oil and gas extracted. Well, efficiency. We're all for efficiency. Who's not? But they take it as sort of that's basically the running room to just go ahead and do whatever they want as a minerals management agency, and basically turn the DEC into a minerals management agency and just drop the E, the sort of inconvenient E out of their name. Then one other couple of things that they go around and they say we've got the toughest regulations in the country. Well, no, they don't. They're not good. As Ronald pointed out, and as some other people point out, the history of regulating gas wells in New York State is sorry. The number of wells that are actually inspected per year is about 2/3 of the number that say be inspected in Texas. So the regulatory function is flawed. It's inadequate. It was actually audited in '92, and the DEC basically flunked the audit. Let's talk about the regs. They've had 3 iterations of this SGIS, and 80,000 comments and whatever, 1,600 pages and all these hearings, and Ron and I waste our time in. Well, guess what? The setback for a gas well in the state of New York is 100 feet from a house. You can drill one of these big shale gas wells 100 feet from somebody's house, 150 feet from a church, 150 feet from a stream. That's the worst setback in the United States. There's no state. There's no county out west where counties have zoning authority. There's no township anywhere that would have a setback that's low. And these fellows going to have the audacity to say that they have the, New York, just relax, trust us, we got the best, toughest regs. No, you don't. Again, I don't know where those came from, but basically there's no science involved. Setback from a pond, from a lake, is 0. I mean, there's no science there. It's just that's because it sounded like a good number for Chesapeake. The other one, this is getting a little esoteric. I know I'm eating up on Ron's time here, but there's no seismic regulations in this state. In other words, you could shoot a seismic test. You could drill holes, borehole, pack it with dynamite, boom, and check the seismic. And there's no regulations where you can do that in this state, except on state lands. In other words, you could do that right next to a church. I mean, for all I know, you could do it in a cemetery. Kaboom. That's kind of odd, I must say, particularly a cemetery. Like, for instance, in Louisiana, you can't shoot seismic within 1,000 feet of a boat. And then, you all scratch your head. They must be very fond of their boats. Well, because they shoot seismic in bayous. That'd be a dandy way to hold a boat. Not in New York, and you just let it roll. And you're going to hear more about this, but the DEC basically went out of their way to ignore the hard science on this. I mean, you read the S-guys, not only did they ignore it, but they basically took the industry line and they went back and not with the hard science, but they went back and they disputed the hard science that had been presented, particularly from Howarth and from Jackson, Osborne, and the Duke methane study. They just took pot shots at it. It's the kind of pot shots that the industry would have taken. No, isn't that a surprise? And of course, as we know, the non-industry people don't really get a hard look at these regs. They certainly don't get a meaningful input. And for instance, they hired out the review of these 80,000 comments to Alpha Engineering, among others. And Alpha Engineering was the group that they had hired to write the report. So, they might give themselves an A, don't you think? But the rest of us, we're going to get our comments. Ron's well-considered comments will be reviewed by the same people that wrote the report. Gee whiz. I can go on. But this is something too that first caught my eye. This is one of the few states in the United States that does not tax gas at the wellhead. And the problem with that, there's a couple. One of them is that means nobody's out there actually reading the meter. There's nobody from the state reading the meter that the state would get money off of. This stuff is 7.4% gas tax in Texas. Is 15% in Arkansas. It's 0 in New York, and there's really no state that has any shale gas potential that is, even now Pennsylvania, that is devoid of the state revenue directly from the. And the apologists say, well, New York is they're high taxes. We have high taxes. Well, you're missing one. I'm here to tell you, it's a line on him on a run ticket. The state severance tax. Just let that roll off of your tongue. The science, or sort of the environmental science, if you will, that's manifest in the S-guys, is really a bunch of political payoffs. I know that's the wrong term, I think, but what I mean is that I'm sorry, nothing impugned here. But I mean it's directly a function of the number of voters affected. I mean it's not just New York City's reservoirs, but you can trace that all the way down to, say, the lowly organic dairy farmer who has, voting presence of zilch, if you look at the setbacks, for instance, the protections in the S-guide, it's a direct function of population. It's really a remarkable piece of work. Some firm in Houston probably dreamed it up. But that is in fact the science. In other words, you could take those regs and you could match them up, correlate them with the number of people protected, and that is the science. It's political science. I don't mean to insult any poli-sci majors, but that's not science. Sorry. This is a sort of an anecdote, but the revolving door at the DEC is basically directly to the industry. I mean, they may be out there, and I wish they would raise their hands, but Ron and I don't run into any ex-DEC employees, on the anti-fracking circuit. It's they're all the people we run into, or the fracking shills, if you pardon the expression, ma'am, are ex-DEC employees, and that's because they're minerals management people, like they would be in Colorado, or in Texas at the Railroad Commission. That's understandable, but there's no revolving door for an environmentalist. The fact that they have an environmentalist, as their figurehead that's good for. So let me make some suggestions, if I may. Your assembly colleagues, I think, might want to subpoena these people. I think, if they don't answer your questions, well, come tell mama. Bring it on. I think they need to be subpoenaed. I think what you'd find is you'll confirm what these FOIL documents is that you basically have colloquies as if they were legal colleagues in the same firm, between a minerals management agency, which in fact would have this dialogue with the industry that it regulates. It's not out of the question, but that it is exclusive in that regard. It's exclusively a colloquy between the industry and the permitting function of that agency, to the exclusion of any environmental review. I think obviously you need to, enter the 21st century and have a separate naturals resource. Call it the Bureau of Mines or some darn thing. But I mean, that's the normal. That's the normal thing to do. Is you separate it out. You put it under the revenue or permitting, whatever. Put it back where it was, I suppose. You have to have an autonomous environmental agency that doesn't have any business in the permitting or even the technical regulations of the drilling and fracking itself. Got to have a severance tax. I mean, that's just silly. You got to respect home rule. It's the law in every other state, even in Texas. You got to get rid of this compulsory integration law. It's just tease people up to get pushed into well. It really rubs me the wrong way. And that's what I got to say for myself. Thank you.
I think it would be helpful just for you to state your background in the oil.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of glossed over that. I was a planning manager at Atlantic Richfield at ARCO in the late 70s. I had a company, or I was a co-owner of a company that we sold to Atlantic Richfield. Subsequently, in 1986, I started investing in oil and gas rigs, oil and gas drilling rigs, mainly offshore rigs. And I was invested in those, a series of rigs up until 2006. And then I have owned oil and gas production in the states of New Mexico and Texas. The rigs are all over the world. But just as for instance, the rigs were subject to Coast Guard regulations. The oil and gas properties were subject to the BLM, to the feds, to the state of New Mexico, the state of Texas, county regs. So, and this was all before the EPA got fracked out of the oil and gas business in 2005. So everything, in some of those properties would have maybe 3 or 4 regulatory agencies, including the EPA, and that is typical out west. In fact, I think maybe the record is like California, where there's 6 regulatory agencies that have supervision over oversight over oil and gas drilling. So that's probably a good place to start, is to bifurcate that activity. And like you say, to put this in perspective, if that doesn't happen, then you just really should not be doing this here. If this was out in the bleak West Texas, it'd be another thing. There's nobody living out there and whatnot, and no wells to pollute. But it's not. The hydrological and topographical scenario in this state is just terrible to be doing this sort of thing. And frankly, if there was any part of Texas that even halfway looked like this, we wouldn't be doing it. Thank you.
Senator Squadron has a question.
Just very briefly,
Yeah,
I know we've got kind of just two items. Any estimate on what a severance tax could net the state?
No, well, right now it'd be kind of a big fat zero because that's another thing about this is that this is a real roller coaster revenue source, and we didn't get into this, but none of these dry shale gas wells would be economic in this state at this time. This is dry methane. None of these wells should be economic. There would be no ad valorem tax paid to local municipalities because they're all a function of the profitability of the well, and they would be shut in. So, I mean, not to be facetious, although it comes easily to me, it would be close to zero. You see because it's really based on the productivity. Like, for instance, the severance tax in Texas, it's the net present value of the well. And if it's unproductive at this point, it was shut in, it'd be like zero. But I mean, it could be, if at 5%, on the other hand, at $10 an MCF, it could be a lot of money. And it's certainly, it's a functionally a necessary amount of money, or you have no money to pay for the state roads. You have no money to pay for the 15 regulators that the DEC has. Anyway, excuse me.
So, and just the other question, a lot of different states got thrown out there. I think we all noted that we're worse than Louisiana, and sadly.
Well, I don't mean to offend it. It's a convenient whipping boy for Texans.
It works in New York too. So, but quite seriously, a lot of different states. If you were to compare New York's regulatory and oversight structure, in terms of both effectiveness and independence, to another state in the union, what state would that be and why? Or is
I would probably Belize. Maybe. No, Belize. Wouldn't you say Belize? No. Colombia, maybe.
So none of the other 49.
No. Well, first of all, let me say that's addressed. That's addressed in this paper. It's because it compares the 31 quote shale states, the regulatory structures of 31 shale states. If you throw in the lack of a severance tax, which is important because absent a severance tax, you have no revenue.
So New York
it'd be pretty much at the bottom.
New York is the single worst
probably
of oversight and independence in the nation, in your view.
I think so. I haven't seen it. If you put all those factors together, I don't see there's nobody that'd be any worse. I don't think.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Senator Kruger now has a question. Yeah. No. She has one more question.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
All right, so your follow-up to Senator Squadron's question about how much we could make off a severance tax and the point that these wells really couldn't be profit-making at this point leads me to the follow-up question. Some people have suggested that this whole exercise in New York State right now is sort of akin to mortgage purchase sale debacle trades, and that Chesapeake and some of the other companies who originally went into contracts with landowners to have the rights to drill is really a business exercise in itself, now leading to flipping, so to speak, or group sales of the rights. Do you have, you were shaking your head, so maybe I should have waited until you got to testify, but do you have an opinion about, like, the business model of what's really going on here?
It's a Ponzi scheme, ma'am. That's basically, what happened in New York and Deborah Rogers has really done some really good work on this, is that it was, in fact, a land flipping exercise, and the financing of it was actually facilitated when they changed the SEC rules in 2008. And basically, what it did is it enabled you to make up any value that you wanted for your reserves. So you go out, you'd tie up a lot of land, you'd basically try and lease land from some dude in a beard driving a buggy, and for nothing, which is what they did, and And then you would find a well, drill a test well, pick your best well, and then you go get a Netherlands Sewell or some reservoir engineer down in Houston to give your assets on your reserves a big value, and then you float junk bonds against it, or you'd sell stock or whatever. So it was, it was kind of a scam. It is kind of a scammy deal. It's not that all of these wells are uneconomic. It's just that the overall financing structure, it's not like some mortgages are good, but there was the preponderance of it was a scam, which is why basically Chesapeake collapsed, and. Among other reasons. The thing obviously that tripped it up is all that works as long as the price of gas goes up. As the price of gas goes back, then all this is basically exposed. The falsehoods of it are exposed. So yeah, it was kind of a scam, and particularly here in New York, where they tied up a bunch of land. Let me just one quick point about that. Senator Grisanti tried to increase the well spacing from 1 square mile to 2 square miles. The reason why Chesapeake wanted him to do that is because you can hold the acreage with one well. So in other words, if you increase the spacing unit size to 1,280, 2 square miles, then basically you could hold the leasing of with just one well. That's not so good. That's in the gas industry's favor to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
you, sir.
We really appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
Okay, hi, I'm Ron Bishop. I'm probably not going to be as flamboyant as Chip.
Speak closer into the mic.
Sure. Now, a little about me. I was born in Ohio, actually born in the city of Youngstown. You might have heard of that. Although there's no reason other than earthquakes lately that anyone should have heard of it. I got my bachelor's degree in chemistry from Youngstown State University, and then I moved from Ohio to West Virginia to get a job. Not everybody can say that. After managing a laboratory at the medical school for a couple of years, I was strongly encouraged to apply myself, and so then a few years later they kicked me out with a PhD degree from the West Virginia University School of Medicine. Following that, I did postdoctoral work with a contractor for the National Cancer Institute at Fort Detrick, Maryland, for several years. And then after that, I went to work for a biotechnology company, especially working on biosafety issues, especially viruses and so forth. And during that time, realizing that I had liked the contact with the interns and students and all that sort of thing that I did not get with the biotech industry, I also went back to night school for education to make an intentional conversion from full-time research to full-time teaching. And I've been then doing full-time teaching since then. I currently teach chemistry and biochemistry at the State University of New York at Oneonta. That'll handle those sorts of questions for you. Now, how did I get into this mess? About 4.5 years ago, some friends of mine in a very new at that time group called Sustainable Otsego heard of an industry like this shale gas industry, coming our way, and they asked me if I knew anything about it, thinking that since I lived in an area with a lot of minerals extraction before, I might. Well, I didn't. And I started looking around myself, who can teach me about this industry, who can tell me what to expect. Because they tapped me, not only because I'm an academic, with chemistry and biochemistry, but I'm also a construction professional, a commercial industrial electrician with quite a few years of experience working my way through school. So I actually at that time went to the only people I knew who could teach me, the people at Schlumberger, Halliburton, BJ Well Services, and the like. And I learned an awful lot about the gas and oil business from them. I've learned a lot more in the meantime from a good friend of mine, Lou Allstadt, a retired vice president of Mobil Oil Corporation, who is a friend and a neighbor, and his wife and I sing in a group locally. So this is sort of my exposure to the industry, as of about 2008. And along the way, I decided to started to try to take a hard look at, okay, well, what's the science? What can we expect? Using my tools as a scientist, as a chemist, what can I find out of what's been going on? I'd heard a lot of hand waving on both sides, and I hadn't picked one. And I can make that longer story shorter. I've picked one now.
Okay, what is it?
For the record, those who say that hydraulically fracturing with horizontal high volume, high pressure, hydraulic fracturing to extract oil and gas from unconventional resources, those who say it can be done safely have yet to demonstrate a single location where that's been shown. So when I've looked for the place where, that's kind of fun. Somebody.
Somebody's leaning against the light switch. Can you repeat that again?
Sure. I have heard it said by others that extraction of oil and gas through horizontal, high volume, high pressure hydraulic fracturing, and then in subsequent recovery of the resources from unconventional, reservoirs can be done safely. I have not found a single location in the world where that is actually true. And we now have a lot of locations in the world where that's been going on for almost 10 years. So I follow the data, and the results, the evidence tells me it can't be done safely. It hasn't been done safely. Now, what I want, and I've done some writing on the subject. I did, in my terms, a scoping document white paper that I called a chemical and biological risk assessment for natural gas extraction in New York. And if you haven't received a copy, I'll make sure you have at least an electronic one before I go. And subsequent to that, I started developing different sections of that white paper for special study. And as a result of that, I actually did provide some of you at your Canandaigua meeting, although I wasn't able to attend because my teaching load prevented me. I talked about the history of oil and gas well abandonment in New York State. And to me, the upshots of that history were that in the 1970s, when DEC records were first beginning to be kept, we had our best reported success in enforcing industry compliance for plugging abandoned wells. And that rate at that time was 24%. Through the 1980s and 90s, their success rate in enforcing compliance and plugging inactive wells dropped by half to 12%. And then in the 2000s, it dropped by half again to 6%, where we are today as an average. So we see a DEC that is actually at an all-time record low point for actually enforcing compliance on one of the most important aspects of the industry. Now, what I want to focus on for you today is just two case studies that say there's a little bit more trouble in Houston. I'm going to talk about two instances of pretty traditional vertical well projects fouling New York homeowners' water wells. You may or may not have actually heard about the details. I picked these two case studies because they're very interesting from a couple perspectives, and they're very well documented. Another thing that is a little bit unusual, because I find that for most of these kinds of incidents, our DEC is very good at efficiently sweeping the stuff under the rug. But here's two that got away from them, and I'll just introduce them to you, and I'll leave your people, possibly Rebecca, with all kinds of paperwork if she'd like to follow up, possibly with the Office of the Inspector General, or maybe you'd like to subpoena some of these people. In the February of 2009, the David Eddy family noticed that there was a ring of new natural gas wells going in and around their property. And they could hear, of course, the logging and all of the other preparatory steps. They could, see all of the trucks that were related to the grading of the well pads. And then they knew when frac week came, because they could hear the uptick in the in the business. Now, these are a lot smaller and more compact kinds of projects, but there were 4 of them in a ring around this family's home, about from as near as about 330 feet to as far as about 1,500 feet away. And they were all being developed by U.S. Energy Development Corporation, which, although it's not based in the state, has a major office in Gettysville, just north of Buffalo. They noticed a big change in their water on frac week. And again, these guys were operating fairly sensible, that is to say, bring the well services companies in all at one time to do 4 very close together wells. That's just a good business model. But the Eddy family called everybody. They called the county, health department, the environmental branch at the time headed by Tom Hull, and they also, of course, called the DEC. And the agent who's most active out there in Region 9 in that part of the region would be Brian Jandrew, and his boss is Chris Miller. You may know Chris because of having been reprimanded just this last year by the Office of the Inspector General for failing to divest himself of management of his family's oil and gas business before taking a supervisory role with DEC. But I'll let you guys work that out. U.S. Energy came and did their own well water testing. They also invited Culligan from nearby Bradford, Pennsylvania, to come and do some well water testing for this family. The company, U.S. Energy's well water test showed nothing wrong. And the Culligan company's water test showed something was wrong. There was they found traces of oil and oil byproducts in the water well. The kind that didn't belong there. And a follow-up sampling by the Allegheny County Health Department also found some of these problems with the well. And this is what the family was complaining about: bad odor, bad smell. It tasted like gasoline. This is, by the way, very strange. This is not the kind of damage you expect from a gas well anywhere. Particularly not the fairly dry gas wells, because the targets out in their part of the state are typically the Medina sandstones. These Medina sands live below the Marcellus but above the Utica, and it's believed that it's the Utica that's actually the source of the resources that are in the Medina sands. But they're dry gases. They're not very many of the wet hydrocarbons that have to be purified away from them. And in fact, across wide swaths of the state, Medina wells, our DEC permits companies like Lenape Resources to actually market the gas without any post-processing except for separation from the brine. So that's really dry gas. So how did the Eddy family get oil into their water well? Where would that have come from? This is a big mystery. It's a mystery that Brian Jandrew spoke about at length with a landowners coalition head who went out to visit him, but he wouldn't talk to me when I called him on the phone. I found that interesting. And his best guess was, well, there was an abandoned well in between the Eddy family and this arc of new gas wells being developed. And on frac day, when they, of course, were able to, send out, these hydraulic fractures in the Medina sandstone, which are targeted to go 200 to 500 feet. The occasional one gets away and goes for half a mile, might have intersected with this abandoned well. Now, no search for an abandoned well was ever conducted that I could find any documentation for. And as I mentioned, Brian Jandrew wouldn't speak at any length with me about it when I called him on the phone. So shortly, now U.S. Energy, while saying they had nothing to do with the Eddy's water well problems, installed for the Eddy family a carbon filter water treatment system, and they also offered the Eddy family a cash payment if they would sign a non-disclosure agreement. He took the filter system, but he said no to the cash, and that's one reason it's as well documented as it is today. Well, this all happened out in about 2009, and the wrap-up that I could see from the County Health Department documents and the U.S. Energy documents was about August or September of 2009, and I hadn't heard anything more. So I decided to FOIL request a final disposition, a final investigative report from the DEC. Well, what did you decide? I filed this with the DEC on August 15th of 2011. And I received from the DEC that disposition letter, dated September 8th, 2011. So when you ask for a final report, they'll get around to writing one. And the conclusions of this letter basically said, well, it's an incontrovertible, it's highly probable that natural gas development was responsible for fouling the Eddy family's water well. But because we don't know which of the 4 wells being developed near their home was the culprit, we can't assign blame or anything like that. And so when the SGICE was being written and they said, well, there have been no incidents across the state to speak of, they didn't speak of that one because it was inconclusive. But if you like that, you'll love this one. The family of David Ferrugia lives in Cayentone Township, Chautauqua County. That's just south of Jamestown. And they built on 22 acres a new house out there in 2001. They had a new well put in, and of course they had it analyzed, at the time they put it in. It wasn't just a sale like with the Eddy family who bought their property in 2003, but they did the whole ball of wax with that. They heard that some new gas development was coming into their neighborhood soon, so they then did a pre-drilling baseline water quality study on their water well. And in fact, the local driller participated with that. Now, the local driller had about 3 wells within about 1,000 feet of the Ferrugia family, although in the paperwork, Jack Dahl and Chris Miller only ever referenced one of them, the one that's about 330 feet away. And that seemed to be all that they were interested in. But a couple of years after the initial development of this, series of gas wells, well, a couple of years after the one development of the one gas well that our investigators they will talk about, actually just a couple of months after the development of the others, the Ferrugias noticed some very big problems, that had come about with their water well. It was tasting salty, it had a sulfur-like smell, and it was making them sick. They called everybody. They called the Chautauqua County Health Department. The water quality specialist there, Bill Boria, is the guy on the scene. They also, of course, called the DEC, and Region 9 officials once again are on the scene for that. And the water quality specialist there did a couple of tests, and he determined that their well water had gone up dramatically from its earlier tests. Dramatically in terms of methane content, chlorides content, and also a couple of the heavy metals that are associated, typically with the brines of gas drilling. And so he thought that it was highly probable that gas development had actually been responsible for somehow messing up this family's water well. And he also recommended that do not try to use the water. He reported his results by means of this memorandum of understanding between the county health department there and Region 9 of our DEC's Bureau of Oil and Gas Regulation, that the first initial investigations are often done by the county health department. And they looked at his relatively exhaustive paper, which I have for you here, 15 pages, and I won't read it to you, and they disagreed. They thought his they mentioned some anomalies of the hydrogeology there. They mentioned some things they just didn't feel convinced. We don't know why. They said the timing seems to be off. And after all, the first thing that the Ferrugias seemed to be complaining about was a bacterial problem. Although I have to say, when they tested for coliform bacteria, it wasn't coliform bacteria, it was some other kind. Then the USGS out in that area, which had been copied on the correspondence between the DEC and the county health department, weighed in and said, I don't think either of you has quite enough information to call it a slam dunk with gas well development or to say that it wasn't related to gas well development. And there was then a follow-up by Bill Boria, who answered a lot of the points made by both the USGS people and also by the DEC, Chris Miller and Jack Dahl. Among other things I should mention to you about is that Bill Boria has been their water quality specialist there for 27 years. He's not new to the area or the science. And as a final disposition, what I want to mention is that some of the things that the DEC people were complaining couldn't happen, was, for example, this idea of bacterial contamination. It must be their septic field, their leach fields, or something like that. And Bill Boria described in detail, because of being with the county, he had all the records. There's no possible way for their septic system and leach fields, and besides, the bacteria that showed up weren't coliform. Actually, I can tell you, based on the fact that they smelled hydrogen sulfide, we know what kind of bacteria they were. They're an ancient life form called archaea, and their name is probably Desulfovibrio desulfuricans. And when you do top hole drilling, as is common in the state of New York, with no biocides, with no drilling mud at all, mostly with compressed air and a little bit of glycol ethers for foaming agents, you go down about 100 feet past, deeper than the nearest usable water well, and then you pull all your rigging up to set the surface casing. And that's when the bacterial contamination happens. The bacteria that are on your drilling rig that you went down to, say, 800 or 900 feet, depending on what the nearest usable water was in the area, often encounters these zones that are rich in these sulfate-reducing bacteria. And then when you bring them up into a freshwater aquifer, they take off, at least in the bottom of the aquifer where there isn't as much oxygen. And the difference, of course, is that if you contaminate someone's underground water, drinking water with chemicals, you've got a bad problem for the next few hundred years. But if you contaminate them with a biological, you're done. They not only don't get diluted out, they multiply. That's what bacteria like to do. And so the color of the Ferrugia family's water, the dark gray that was showing up in their toilet, and the odor from the water, the sulfate, reducing bacteria's production of hydrogen sulfide, is a pretty good indicator that we know what kind of archaea was in there. And there's only one way to get that in there: neighboring drillers following the waterway, not chemically but biologically. Over and over again, I have attempted to provide this information, this kind of information, this academic qualifier to the DEC for the last 4 years, that this is an aspect of the drilling industry they need to be careful of. They have not returned any of my messages. They have not returned my papers either, so I'm hoping that they read them. But what I'm seeing is that they have access to people who've done research, who've been looking hard at the independent scientists. It's on my dime. I'm doing all of this. But I'm not getting the same kind of access. I see people like Chesapeake and Nornu and Range getting to our DEC. So I just put that out there. This is the science, though, that we have, is that our agency is trying to look better than they are by sweeping some things under the rug. And you might like to question them on that. Thank you.
Go. Do we have copies of those? Can you provide us with copies?
I'll give you. I didn't have time to make a lot of copies. I have this copy.
If you can email
and I have
them,
a thumb
we'll do.
drive that I can provide you with lots of wonderful stuff.
Right.
So I'll be happy to leave those here for you.
Questions? No? Thank you. Your testimony was great.
Thank you.
Oh, Senator Montgomery has a question?
I just wanted to ask, well, actually, this is from the testimony of Mr. Northrop, but you may be able to answer it.
We'll see how that goes. Although believe it or not, I don't usually speak for Chip.
He talked about the fact that there are no regulations in terms of setback, the number of setback of a well from a homeowner's property or home.
He said there are no setbacks for seismic testing.
Okay.
And I can, by the way, attest to that because I happen to live in a town you may have heard of. That's Middlefield in Otsego County. And Gastem actually set off some dynamite charges at 7 a.m. one morning in the hillside, on the hill overlooking my home. They hadn't told anybody that they were going to do that, but, well, we all figured it out really soon. So yeah, actually the deal that there's no real setback, there are also apparently no local warning requirements for seismic testing, because our first warning was the dynamite, although it was very effective.
Actually, Chip is going to come back if you
Oh,
want
okay.
to.
Oh, good. Oh, great. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about the regulations on setbacks and the way that homeowners' property, the mortgage on a homeowner's property may be voided based on the fact that a well is not far enough from that property?
Right.
The insurance and the homeowner's mortgage?
Yes, ma'am. That's Beth Ratto is an attorney, and she's going to testify about that specifically in a minute. I'm not an attorney, nor do I play one on YouTube, but it's pretty simple. The problem is that the setback in this state is from a gas well a drilling rig from a house is less than what the FHA or the Fannie Mae Freddie Mac guidelines would be. So that's just that's about as simple as it can get. But the problem is that you could drill a well under the DEC regs that would just toast your mortgage, because you'd be in violation of the loan covenants of the mortgage. It would also, as I think Senator Avila said earlier, it would also void your warranty. Your insurance. So the problem is that again is the regulations in this state are so bad that they wouldn't pass muster at Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, in the secondary mortgage market, or in the insurance industry, in the homeowners insurance industry.
Next panel may actually be able to go better to that question.
Yeah.
Senator Stewart Cousins, wait a second.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you, Professor, before you go. I was really, and thank you, Senator Avila, for pulling us together so that once again, we can hear the concerns, the fears, and once again, not have anyone who could tell us any different. So based on what you were saying, I've written your quote, you were saying that I have not found a single location in the world that is actually true when it comes to the safety of this process. Is that what you said, right?
Right? That's what I said. In
the whole world.
Well, yeah, my writing has been focused on New York, but my initial look at the business of the shale oil and gas business had me looking at work sites in Croatia, Sweden, Norway, Poland, UK, as well as in the U.S., Canada, Nigeria, and so on. And there are problems everywhere, and they're profound. Some of the problems, some of the states have managed by means of a combination of regulations and enforcement to encounter different problems than others. For example, the state of Michigan has a fairly shallow shale, the Antrim Shale, and you would think that they would have had more groundwater contamination than other states because their shale is actually closer to the surface and more problematic to keep away from groundwater. As a matter of fact, more of the problems in Michigan because they realized that they had a real issue with their shallow resource. They stepped up their enforcement activity fourfold. They put a lot of money into the project. And they've still had problems, and there are a couple of major documents, are actually video documentaries, one of them with the not-so-fetching name Journey of the Forsaken, that comes from Michigan. But the biggest problems that they've actually had were with companies drilling unregistered, unlicensed pipelines. The most intensive drilling in Michigan has been in the North Woods. Actually, the most intensively drilled county in Michigan is Otsego County, a cruel twist of fate for me because I live in Otsego County, New York. But getting through the North Woods is actually very difficult, and so they've just been basically plowing up stream banks to lay pipelines and things like that. So if you can pick your different area, and you have a different range of problems depending on the success or the failures of their regulatory regime. The biggest problems with air quality seem to have been encountered in Pennsylvania, of course, Colorado and Wyoming. But Kansas has also had profound problems with air quality. People that I have met who are from there say, well, you know, how long can you hold your breath driving up the highway? You don't even have to live next to the stuff. So no, there's not a single place in the world where this has been, you know, attempted at any level of intensity, where the industrialization hasn't gotten away from them. The scale of the step change in the industry, more than any other aspect of it, is what takes people by surprise. When you step up from developing a well with 80 to 100,000 of fluids, and now you need 5 million gallons of fluids, that step change of 50-fold is unsustainable. Basically, you know, you might get away with it once or twice, but by the time your 10th well is in, somebody's been hurt. And it's just been all over the world, that's what we've seen consistently.
And I know that we have another panel, so I won't keep you. So I just wanted to say that you are saying that no matter what, there's a problem. And in New York, our ability to regulate is the lowest, at the lowest capacity possible.
Right. So even with the best regulations, which I don't believe we have, and you can default to Chip on that, although I've studied them too, even with the best regulations, without the boots on the ground, we're doomed. And when we don't have boots on the ground, and we know what happens to DEC commissioners that ask for more resources from the governor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know we're sort of taking a little bit more time with these first couple of panels, but I think, as you'll agree, their testimony has been very important. The next panel is Elizabeth Radow and Jeanette Barth.
So, okay, I think I'm going to start, correct? Okay. Thank you for inviting me to testify. I'm an economist, and I've been developing... I'm Jeanette Barth. I am an economist, and I've been developing economic models and conducting economic analyses for over 35 years. For over 3 years, I've been dedicating much of my time to investigating the potential economic impact of shale gas development in New York. I have no financial interest related to shale gas development other than as a New York State taxpayer, landowner, and citizen. It's very clear that biased and inaccurate information is being spread by the gas industry, and the press and our own DEC are repeating the false claims. Our decision makers in both Albany and Washington may be relying on this misinformation. Independent researchers not funded by the gas industry reach vastly different conclusions from the industry-funded studies. The studies funded by the gas industry exaggerate benefits and ignore significant costs. They often use exaggerated reserve and production estimates, thereby overstating projections of jobs, income, and tax revenue. They ignore costs to communities, such as the costs associated with increased truck traffic, costs associated with increased demands on fire departments, police, hospitals, and social services. They ignore the fact that extractive industries are known for creating short-term booms followed by long-term busts. Industries that are not compatible with an industrial landscape or with potential water, air, and land contamination are likely to decline in the region. In New York State, examples of such industries that are vital to the region include agriculture, organic farming, tourism, outdoor recreation, winemaking, and hunting and fishing. And crowding out of many businesses is likely as well, leaving economically devastated communities down the road. Just look to Appalachia as an example of this. An ignored opportunity cost to upstate communities is the loss of future development as vast networks of pipelines are built, ruling out future building and economic development over or adjacent to the pipelines after the gas industry and its short-term jobs leave the area in a few years. We have recently learned that at least one major insurance company is unwilling to insure against the unique risks associated with fracking. If one cannot get a residential mortgage due to industrial activity on the property, or if one cannot get homeowners insurance, or if drinking water becomes contaminated, home values and consequently property tax revenue may plummet. The limited and incomplete economic assessment done for the DEC SGEIS suffers the same fatal flaws of the industry-funded studies. Benefits are exaggerated and significant costs are ignored. And by the way, Eugene Leff with the DEC told me that the public will not be given a chance to comment on future revisions to the economic assessment. One of the studies not funded by the industry concludes, and I quote, "Counties that have focused on energy development are unperforming economically compared to peer counties that have little or no energy development." And a peer-reviewed article concludes, "The areas of the United States having the highest levels of long-term poverty tend to be found in the very places that were once the site of thriving extractive industries." And another one concludes that there is clear evidence that resource-dependent counties in the United States exhibit more anemic economic growth. I looked at data on unemployment rates, income levels, and poverty rates in counties in New York State where we have had conventional gas drilling for a long time. I also looked at similar data for counties in Texas, where shale gas drilling has been going on for about a decade. These data support the peer-reviewed conclusions that residents in gas-intensive counties have overall not fared better than residents in other counties. Industry and government have touted shale gas as a means of lessening dependence on foreign energy sources and achieving a cheap and plentiful source for domestic energy consumption. Now it appears that the gas industry is seeking to export U.S. shale gas. Thus, we are putting in jeopardy the environment, public health, and economy of New York State in order to provide profits to the gas industry for supplying the economic development of China. That's not a trade I'd like to make. The oil and gas industry spends huge amounts of money on lobbying, political contributions, public relations, advertising, and even economic impact studies in order to spread falsehoods and hide the truth. Here is the truth. Extractive industries create boom and bust cycles, and communities in upstate New York are likely to be worse off economically in the long run if we allow shale gas development. The oil and gas industry is a highly capital-intensive industry, meaning that vastly more money is spent on equipment than on training and employing workers, who typically follow the rigs from state to state. Thus, encouraging oil and gas development is not an effective strategy for creating jobs in New York. With the industry curtailing production at the same time that energy users are being encouraged to convert to natural gas, and if our shale gas is sold in the global market, supply will be reduced at the same time that demand increases. Under those circumstances, the domestic price of natural gas is unlikely to remain low in the long run. The only parties likely to benefit in the long run from shale gas development in the Marcellus Shale are the gas companies and a very few lucky and large landowners, while serious long-term costs will be borne by the public and local communities. Before making any decisions regarding shale gas drilling in New York, we must insist on comprehensive, unbiased, peer-reviewed assessments of economic impacts for the state and our communities, both short-term and long-term. I urge our leaders to do what is right for the people of New York. Thank you again.
Elizabeth, why don't you go, and then we'll take questions for the panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Avella and colleagues, for inviting me here today. My name is Elizabeth Radow. I'm a lifelong New Yorker, a lawyer, and a mom. I practice real estate, construction, finance, risk management. My article on homeowners and gas drilling leases, boom or bust, which was in the New York State Bar Journal magazine, shined a light on the impacts of the gas drilling on the secondary mortgage market. I chair the Committee on Energy, Agriculture, and Environment, which is formerly known as the Hydraulic Fracturing Committee for the League of Women Voters of New York State. My friend and colleague, Mary Ann Sullivan from the League of Women Voters, will be speaking today on behalf of the League. So it's my published research on the impacts of gas drilling and risk allocation that bring me here today. I speak on my own behalf and on behalf of homeowners impacted by fracking who have read my work and contacted me. These people tell me that they were glad when New York entered the discussion on fracking because New Yorkers are leaders, not followers. They asked me to ask Governor Cuomo if New York will preserve our water so we can be the go-to state when their water is consumed for fracking. Almost 1 year ago, Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee flooded New York's southern tier and regions Governor Cuomo recently targeted for possible hydraulic fracturing. With scores of homes destroyed and soon to be written off the tax rolls, impacted towns understandably need revenue. Others today, Jeanette and Chip, have and will speak about the economics of gas revenue. I will focus on the expense side challenges, which I urge elected officials from all senators to town supervisors and planning boards supporting gas drilling to address and resolve before any permits are issued. According to gas industry public disclosure documents, the drilling and hydraulic fracturing life cycle involves inherently risky activity. Fracking uses hazardous substances. It can cause property damage, pollution, injury, and death. Homeowners with standard gas leases could be responsible for damage and loss resulting from gas industry operations, even though they don't control the workers or the quality of their work. Property owners forced by existing statute, compulsory integration, which Chip spoke about, to accept drilling under their property are also not adequately protected. According to its own disclosure documents, the industry is not fully insured for its drilling operations, including general liability, pollution, and control of well coverage. According to a 2010 Range Resources report, substantial increases in premiums exist in regions affected by hurricanes and tropical storms. Insurers have also imposed revised limits affecting how much they will pay on actual storm claims. Last week, Nationwide Insurance, America's largest homeowners insurance carrier, reported that the company would not bind risks presented by hydraulic fracturing, and any policies currently written with this exposure would be non-renewed. Nationwide said risks involved in fracking operations are too great to ignore and apply to all policies of commercial contractors and landowners who lease property to gas companies. Well, it comes as no surprise that homeowners insurance doesn't cover heavy industrial activity on residential property. But what does this policy clarification mean? Well, first, in cases where the industry does not have enough insurance to cover a loss, it will have to pay out of its own pocket. For homeowners, the clarification may be problematic. Here's why. If other homeowners insurance underwriters adopt Nationwide's policy not to renew homeowners insurance on properties with drilling and fracking, then southern tier families with drilling operations can find themselves with homes they can't insure, can't mortgage, and can't sell. The tax base will likely suffer as well. In 1978, torrential rains triggered the slow leaching of 20,000 tons of life-altering toxic chemicals buried in corroded drums at Love Canal, transforming this Niagara, New York region into what was characterized as the worst ecological disaster of its kind. It resulted in cancer, record numbers of miscarriages, and deformed newborns. Hundreds of families were evacuated, leaving a ghost town behind. The chemicals which caused cancer, birth defects, and threatened lives of people living near Love Canal are also used in hydraulic fracturing. New York has an estimated 75,000 abandoned, deteriorating oil and gas wells and deteriorating water wells also, which can act as pathways for contamination. Many have not been located, as we heard before, adding to the risk of uncontained toxic flowback and produced water surfacing in unintended ways in future drilling and fracking operations. Well blowouts from abandoned wells have been identified by gas industry underwriters as an underinsured, difficult-to-control, growing hazard associated with hydraulic fracturing. With the realities of climate change, heavy rainstorms are likely to revisit southern tier communities. The known impacts from Love Canal can guide New York's actions away from reasonably predictable outcomes involving fracking. As mentioned, gas drilling risks are not fully insured by the industry. DEC can hold the industry responsible for full costs associated with his actions as a condition to the issuance of any drilling permit or do nothing, which will, in effect, leave property owners and potentially all taxpayers vulnerable to foot the bill. In June, out of concern that the state might proceed to issue drilling permits without a safety net, I developed and sent to DEC and the state's Department of Financial Services a plan to manage drilling risks. I am submitting a copy of my risk management plan with today's testimony and am available to answer follow-up questions you might have. Serious environmental and health impacts happen in the presence of drilling and fracking operations. The industry's public disclosure documents say so. So what stops the industry and the rest of us from consistently speaking these truths? One road to common ground would be to stop framing the decision to drill in terms of safety. Inherently risky activity, by definition, isn't safe. Benzene can cause cancer, toluene can cause birth defects, silica sand can cause respiratory distress, even death. Enforced regulations with teeth might reduce the numbers, but won't alter these immutable truths or these immutable facts. In time, cement casings will crack, toxic water and air will migrate, health impacts will result, property values will suffer, and the tax base may too. Where does that leave us? Well, either New York can drill and place an unknown number of people in their property in harm's way, or we can lead the nation by pushing the pause button until the technology evolves to a point where all parties can agree on how to proceed. What's really at stake at this moment are a finite number of gas leases whose terms are about to expire, although political realities may prove otherwise. New York State stands at a crossroads. Governor Cuomo, please, let's make history and not repeat it. Thank you.
I have one question, then Senator Krueger has a question, and Senator Montgomery. Now that Nationwide has come out with this statement, I guess last week, will other insurance companies, in your opinion, sort of follow suit?
I think we're going to have to wait and see. In my review of the report so far, the comments have been, well, what's the big deal? Homeowners insurance never covers these risks. And I think that they're missing the nuance here. This is potentially, whether or not we drill in New York State, in my opinion, a very, very serious problem, and so much so that I've been in touch with the FHFA now for almost a year when I first identified that this was going to be a problem. We've got a $6.7 trillion secondary mortgage market. It is not possible to have a mortgage without homeowners insurance. It's possible to sign a gas lease and not tell your lender, and if everything goes okay, they'll never know about it. But mortgage, insurance rather, is renewed every year. And if your insurance isn't renewed, your lender will find out about it. So it's my belief that, yes, they will, because they're going to wake up now. Nationwide's a big company, and what they're saying is, as I understand it, and I think this is going to be played out over time, we're not going to cancel your policy. But if the drilling activity begins on a property with a gas lease, maybe you can even sign a gas lease, and if we do nothing, we'll leave you alone. But if the drilling begins, we will not renew your policy. So now you're going to have to go to somebody else. In my risk management plan, one of the line items that I've included is the obligation on the part of the industry to fund homeowners insurance. Now, whether or not that's doable, I don't know, but I'm considering these as construction sites, if you will, because they are. They're much more hazardous, but why don't we think about them that way? Everyone in the spacing unit should be named as an additional named insured on a policy for general liability and whatever, and the pollution and whatever else might happen, so that they don't have to go after the companies and sue them, but they should be protected as would anybody who's having construction on their property. And we'll see where that goes.
Senator Kruger.
Thank you. And in fact, Tony asked one of the first questions I was going to ask. I want to thank both of you for testifying. I've worked with you both and read your materials and heard you testify. But Elizabeth, because of the new realizations of insurance or lack thereof, just to double check, even if your neighbors get a well and drill because of the state law where that means things can happen to you, that can also be a basis for an insurance company to say, no, we know it's not your property, but it's still not something we're going to insure. Is that correct?
This is not in the statement. Again, this was a very succinct statement. As I understand it, this was something that was on this was leaked to the press. Frankly, it's very important that it was, because we need to get out ahead of this. As I said, we're drilling in states all over the country. And there was somebody in Pennsylvania recently who applied for a mortgage. He does not have a gas lease, and he was denied the mortgage because there's drilling going on within a short distance of his home. We hear these stories all the time. There's this wonderful woman, Jamie Fredericks, in Ohio, who had compressor activity on the other side of her property. This lovely woman became very ill. She's had surgery, and she consumed the water that nearly killed her. And her home's value has nearly plummeted. Insurance companies are not in the business of giving out money if they don't need to. And so I think that once they start to understand the risks involved and parse them out, I think we're going to see the people, whether or not they have gas leases, whether or not they're forced in, if they live in proximity, we're going to have to watch this unfold and figure out, is this a runaway train? I don't have a grasp on it. I'm trying to stay ahead of it, but I think that we really do need to look at the ripple effects, because I think they could be significant.
Because New York State doesn't even keep a master list of where the contracts have been let for allowing the leases, if I'm an insurance company and I want to establish this policy, how do I know where all these leases and potential drilling is going to take place?
Well, this is actually one of the things that I'd put in comments. We would like to see all of the leases recorded. And I think in many cases, the memoranda of leases are recorded. It's in the best interest of the industry to put the world on notice, but I think they don't want to put the world on notice of all of the terms of those leases necessarily. I would like to see a registry that has not only the leases, but the mortgages. And this is something that I've actually proposed to FHFA, and I'd like to be working on. I think we need to be thinking about this. Again, whether or not we do this in New York, I want to make a point. Many people sitting in this room have our retirement funds invested into the secondary mortgage market. So whether or not we drill in New York, we care that the secondary mortgage market thrives, and we have to make certain that these homes on which we're drilling do not have the property value compromised, because that will compromise the value of our retirement investment.
And may I ask another question? Thank you. And Jeanette, so you've worked on the economics of all this, and I don't know whether you were here earlier when I asked the question about if all of this is just a land flipping Ponzi scheme story. What are the economics of that for New York? Is that like a win-win somehow, bizarrely, that everybody got to sell their land for more money than they thought it was worth, and thank goodness nobody's ever going to drill anyway?
Remember, most of these are leases we're talking about, and flipping leases is what we're talking about. And so no, a lot of people didn't really sell their land for a lot of profit. That I've heard that as well, like a land grab. That's what it was with Chesapeake Energy, for example. And I really recommend the work of Deborah Rogers. I think Chip mentioned that name. She's done a lot of work on explaining this very, very clearly. But that's nobody benefits. And as I've always said, in the long run, the only parties that are going to benefit are the gas companies and a few lucky and large landowners. could I add one thing here I left out of my testimony, but I think it's important given some of the talk I heard Chip mentioned the lack of a severance tax, and that's really important because no money was going to go to New York State.